Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that the price of gas at your local station jumped overnight. Not by a few cents, by $1, maybe two, and nobody in Washington can tell you when it stops. That is not a hypothetical. That is what is happening right now, today, as you watch this. Because last night, the United States military carried out what President Trump called one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East. The target was a tiny 5-mile strip of land sitting quietly in the Persian Gulf, an island most Americans have never heard of. Its name is Kharg Island. And in my view, striking it may have been the single most consequential decision of this entire conflict, not because of the military targets that were hit, but because of what was deliberately left standing, because right now there are nearly 18 million barrels of crude oil sitting in storage tanks on that island. Pipelines running beneath the Persian Gulf floor connect it to some of the largest oil fields on Earth, and President Trump has just told the entire world, in writing, that if Iran does not open the Strait of Hormuz, those tanks, those pipelines, all of it could be next. Think about what that means for a moment. 90% of Iran's oil exports flow through Kharg Island. If that infrastructure goes offline, analysts at J.P. Morgan estimate that oil prices would not just spike. They say prices could go completely out of control. Goldman Sachs is already pricing in a 1 in 4 chance of a global recession. Brent crude closed above $100 a barrel for the second straight day. And the war is only 2 weeks old. We are standing at the edge of something that has not happened since the oil shocks of the 1970s. And very few people are talking about the full picture of what this means for you, for this country, and for the world. So that is exactly what we are going to do today, right here on Unlocked History Hub. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear changes how you understand everything happening in the Middle East right now. Before we go further, if this kind of deep, clear analysis is what you come here for, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. We cover the stories that matter, the ones where the real consequences are buried underneath the headlines. And this story has more buried underneath it than almost anything we have covered before, so do not miss what comes next. Let me take you back to February 28, 2026. That was the day the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated air campaign targeting Iranian military infrastructure, missile production facilities, and nuclear research sites. In the first 24 hours alone, somewhere between 100 and 200 bombs were dropped. Israeli jets flew the largest combat sortie in their Air Force's history. American B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, the most expensive aircraft ever built, dropped 30,000-pound bunker-buster bombs on underground facilities linked to nuclear weapons research. It was a massive opening move. But from day one piece of land was deliberately, conspicuously untouched: Kharg Island. For nearly 2 full weeks, as strikes rained down across Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz, and Karaj, Kharg Island sat untouched. Every military planner, every energy analyst, every diplomat watching this conflict understood why. Touching Kharg meant something entirely different from striking a missile base. It meant crossing a line that could send the global economy into territory it has not visited in 50 years. And then, on the night of March 13, 2026, Trump crossed it. Not fully. Not yet. But he crossed the threshold. Here is what actually happened, and why it matters so much more than the initial headlines suggest. U.S. Central Command struck over 90 military targets on Kharg Island. Targets included naval mine storage facilities, missile storage bunkers, a helicopter hangar, an airport control tower, and air defense systems. The oil infrastructure, the tanks, the jetties, the pipelines, was left untouched. Iranian state media confirmed that oil exports from the island were continuing normally the following morning. 2 tankers were spotted loading crude even as the smoke from the strikes was still visible. So on the surface you might think, okay, the oil is fine. The crisis did not escalate. But that reading misses the entire point of what Trump actually did. And this is where my read of the situation differs from a lot of what you are hearing elsewhere. The strike on Kharg was not primarily a military operation. It was a message, a very specific, very calculated message. And Trump put the message in writing himself on Truth Social. He said, and I want to make sure I get the meaning exactly right here, that he chose not to destroy the oil infrastructure on the island, but that if Iran or anyone else interferes with the free and safe passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, he will immediately reconsider that decision. Read that again slowly. He is saying, I know where your economic lifeline is. I have my forces positioned around it. I hit the military targets. The oil is still running. For now. Stop blocking the strait, or the oil is next. That is not a bombing raid. That is a hostage situation with $100 barrel of crude oil as the ransom note. And Iran heard it that way too. Within hours, Tehran warned that if its oil infrastructure is attacked, it will reduce American-linked oil facilities across the region to what it called a pile of ashes. The IRGC told the United Arab Emirates that American targets on its soil are now legitimate strike targets and urged civilians to evacuate 3 major UAE ports. Qatar paused liquefied natural gas production. Several electricity transmission lines failed in Kuwait. Saudi Arabia shot down drones heading for its Sheba oil field. This is the chain reaction that military planners warned about. This is what happens when you bring a weapon to an oil field and say it is loaded. Now let me explain why Kharg Island specifically is so important, because I do not think most people realize just how much of the global energy system runs through this one tiny place. Kharg Island is about the size of Central Park in New York City. It sits roughly 15 miles off Iran's southwestern coast in the Persian Gulf. It has been the beating heart of Iran's oil export system for decades. Almost every barrel of Iranian crude that reaches China, India, South Korea, or Japan moves through Kharg first. Underwater pipelines connect the island to major oil fields including Avaz, Marun, and Gachsaran. Large supertankers dock at its deep-water jetties. The storage capacity on the island alone is estimated at around 30 million barrels. Iran handles somewhere between 1.1 and 1.5 million barrels per day in exports from this one location. 90% of all Iranian crude that leaves the country moves through Kharg. A CIA assessment from 1984 described the island's facilities as the most vital in Iran's oil system. That assessment is just as accurate today as it was then. If the oil infrastructure on Kharg goes offline, Iran loses most of its export capacity essentially overnight. Analysts at the energy research firm Kepler estimate that it could take months, potentially more than a year, for Iran to rebuild those facilities, especially given that Western sanctions already limit its access to the technology and expertise needed for reconstruction. J.P. Morgan analysts wrote last week that the loss of Kharg's storage buffer and the scarcity of viable export alternatives would rapidly trigger what they called upstream shut-ins across major southwest fields. In plain language, oil production in Iran grinds to a halt. But here is where this stops being just about Iran, because roughly 80% of Kharg's oil goes to China, and 20% of the world's total oil supply still moves through the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has now functionally closed to Western shipping. Tanker traffic through the strait collapsed from 24 vessels per day to near zero. Over 200 commercial ships are currently stranded or anchored outside the strait. Maersk, the largest container shipping company on Earth, suspended all Hormuz crossings. Maritime insurance premiums have hit multi-year highs. And Brent crude briefly touched $119 a barrel earlier this week before settling just above $100. The IRGC issued a public statement that I think deserves more attention than it received. They said, quote, "You will not be able to artificially lower the price of oil. Expect oil at $200 per barrel. $200. For context, the previous all-time high for oil was around $147 in 2008. At $200 a barrel, the economic damage to American families would be severe and immediate. Gas prices, heating costs, the price of food that needs to be transported, the cost of manufacturing, all of it moves with oil. And this brings me to the part of this story that I think is the most underappreciated. The way this conflict is affecting ordinary people around the world right now. Not in some future scenario, but today. Over 1,300 Iranian civilians have been confirmed killed since the war began on February 28th. More than 3.2 million people inside Iran have been displaced. In Lebanon, where Hezbollah opened a second front on March 2nd, nearly 700 people have been killed and over 800,000 displaced. 6 American service members were confirmed dead when a KC-135 refueling aircraft went down over Iraq. 13 American military deaths total as of today. 8 more severely injured. The humanitarian toll is compounding by the day, and economically, the ripple effects are already reaching countries that have no military involvement in this conflict at all. Japan, which depends on the Strait of Hormuz for 70% of its oil imports, has activated emergency reserve drawdowns. Goldman Sachs has pushed back its forecast for Federal Reserve interest rate cuts, citing higher energy-driven inflation. A 1 in 4 chance of recession is now being openly discussed by major financial institutions. This is not a regional conflict with regional consequences. The energy architecture of the modern world runs directly through the waters where this war is being fought. Now here's where I want to share my perspective on the strategic picture, because I think it raises questions that are not being asked loudly enough. The United States has now struck more than 6,000 targets inside Iran since this war began. Iran's ballistic missile launch rate has dropped 90% from day one. Its drone launch rate is down 83%. By those numbers alone, it looks like overwhelming success. But here is the contradiction that sits at the center of this conflict. Iran's missile volume has collapsed, and yet Wave 42, 43, and 44 of Operation True Promise 4 all landed in a single 24-hour period on March 12th, carrying the heaviest individual warheads Iran has ever fired in this campaign. 2-ton warheads on Khorramshahr ballistic missiles, hypersonic Fateh systems, Khaybar-Shikan missiles with active terminal guidance that corrects its own flight path as it falls toward its target. Iran has not run out of capability. Iran has made a deliberate choice to shift from volume to mass. Fewer missiles, but each one carrying more destructive power. That is not the behavior of a country on its last legs. That is rationing for a long war. And what concerns me is that there is still no clear off-ramp here. Trump has said the war will last as long as necessary. Iran's new supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who has not appeared publicly in person since the war began, and whose whereabouts remain unconfirmed, issued his first command not as a military order but as an economic one. Keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. Iran's lead negotiator has said there will be no negotiations. Trump is demanding unconditional surrender. Iran is demanding financial reparations and binding international guarantees. Those two positions do not exist in the same universe. There is no mediator. There is no agreed channel. There is no framework for what comes after. I want to be clear about something here. I am not arguing that any particular side is right or wrong in this conflict. What I am saying is that when a war reaches the doorstep of the world's most critical oil chokepoint, with no off-ramp, no mediator, and a threat to destroy an island that handles 90% of one country's crude exports, the consequences belong to everyone. They belong to the American family filling up at the gas station. They belong to the Japanese factory worker whose manufacturing costs just spiked. They belong to the families in Iran and Lebanon who have already lost everything. And they belong to the global financial system that is now beginning to price in outcomes that would have seemed unthinkable 6 months ago. The world changed on February 28th when this war started. It changed again on March 13th when the United States struck Kharg Island. And what happens in the next few days, whether Iran opens the strait, whether Trump follows through on his threat to target the oil infrastructure, whether any country steps forward as a genuine mediator, will determine whether this crisis becomes something history books study for a generation. I will leave you with one thought that I keep coming back to. Kharg Island survived the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when it was targeted repeatedly. The Iranians repaired it, rebuilt it, and kept exporting oil. The island has survived before. The question right now is not whether it can survive another strike. The question is, what happens to the rest of the world if it does? That is what is at stake. That is why this matters, not just to people in the Middle East, but to anyone in America who pays an energy bill, buys groceries, or has savings in a market that just got a 1 in 4 chance of recession handed to it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know what you think. Do you believe there is still a diplomatic path out of this? Or has the strike on Kharg Island moved this conflict past the point of no return? Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening right now, because most people are only getting half the story. And subscribe to Unlocked History Hub if you want to stay ahead of what comes next. We will be right here when the next chapter breaks.